My fiancé handed me a stack of legal papers and said, "Sign the house over to me or the wedding is off." She said it 2 weeks before our wedding while we were sitting in my living room, which I'd inherited from my grandmother 5 years ago. The papers were already filled out with just a signature line waiting for me. "What are you talking about?" I asked, staring at the deed transfer documents. Rebecca put her engagement ring on the coffee table between us. "It's simple. If you really love me, you'll prove it by putting the house in my name. Otherwise, we're done." We'd been together for 3 years and engaged for 8 months. The wedding was fully planned with 200 guests invited. "Rebecca, this house has been in my family for 60 years. Why would I sign it over to you?" She stood up and started pacing. "Because I need security. What if you leave me after we have kids? I'll have nothing. We didn't even have kids yet." "That's what prenups and divorce laws are for," I said, but she shook her head. "Not good enough. I want the house now before the wedding as a show of faith." My best friend Jake was there helping us with wedding favors and his jaw dropped. "Rebecca, that's insane. This house is worth $800,000. She turned on him immediately. "This doesn't concern you, Jake. This is between me and my future husband." Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Besides, I already told my family the house would be mine." I stood up then. "You told your family what?" She shrugged like it was nothing. "My dad needs collateral for his business loan. I said he could use our house. Well, my house once you sign it over." Her father had started 4 businesses in 5 years and they'd all failed. "Your dad wants to use my house as collateral." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Our house," she corrected. "Once we're married, everything is ours anyway. You're just making it official early." Jake pulled out his phone and started texting someone. Rebecca noticed immediately. "Who are you texting? This is private family business." But Jake kept typing. "My cousin is a real estate attorney. He's on his way." Rebecca's face went red. "We don't need lawyers. This is about trust. If you trusted me, you'd sign." That's when things got weird. She pulled out her phone and made a call. "Daddy, he's refusing to sign. You need to come over." Within 10 minutes, her father, Harold, and her 2 brothers showed up. They walked into my house without knocking. "So, you're the one breaking my little girl's heart," Harold said, standing too close to me. "I'm not breaking anyone's heart. I'm just not giving away my house," I said, backing up. Her brother, Dennis, laughed. "Give away? You're getting a wife in return. That's more than fair." The other brother, Carl, started looking around the room. "This place could be worth more if we knocked out some walls. Open concept sells better." They were already planning renovations. "Nobody is knocking out walls." "This is my house," I said, but Harold stepped closer. Not for long. "Rebecca, honey, did you tell him about the other thing?" Rebecca smiled then, a mean smile I'd never seen before. "Oh, right, I'm pregnant." She pulled out a pregnancy test from her purse. 2 lines, positive. "So unless you want your child to be homeless, you'll sign those papers." That's when my neighbor, Mrs. D. Cho, knocked and walked in. She looked upset. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know. There's a moving truck outside and men are loading your furniture." We all ran to the window. Sure enough, there were movers taking my couch. What the hell? I ran outside with everyone following. The movers had paperwork. Rebecca Walsh hired us. Said she's the owner now. She'd hired them before I'd even signed anything. "She's not the owner," I yelled, but they kept loading. Luis called the police while Harold tried to smooth things over. "Look, son, just sign the papers and this all goes away." But then Rebecca's phone rang. She answered and her face went white. "What do you mean the loan was denied?" Harold grabbed her phone. "They found out about the house?" he said loudly. "You said it was a done deal." That's when everything clicked. They'd been planning to use my house as collateral before the loan even went through. Rebecca had told her father he could count on it, which meant she'd been working this scheme for weeks, maybe months. The moving truck wasn't some desperate last-minute idea. She'd scheduled it in advance, betting I'd cave under pressure from her whole family showing up. A car pulled up fast, and Jake pointed. A guy in his 30s jumped out carrying a leather bag, and even from the driveway, I could tell he meant business. He walked straight to the movers and started taking pictures with his phone, then turned to photograph the truck's license plate, the company name on the side, and every piece of furniture they'd loaded. Harold stepped toward him, but the guy held up one hand while still taking pictures with the other. He asked who authorized this move, and Harold said it was private family business. The guy pulled out a business card and handed it to Harold, Michael Stevenson, real estate attorney. He said he was representing me now, and that everyone present should know they were participating in attempted theft of property. Harold laughed and said his daughter owned the house. Michael asked for documentation, and Harold pointed at Rebecca. She fumbled with her purse, but Michael cut her off, saying he meant legal documentation like a deed or title transfer. Rebecca's face went red, and she said the paperwork was finalized. Michael asked if she meant the unsigned documents inside my house that I refused to sign, which made Rebecca go quiet. He told Harold that showing up with a moving crew to take someone's property without legal ownership was textbook theft, and he was documenting everything for the police report and potential criminal charges. Carl stepped up and said Michael should mind his own business. Michael didn't move back an inch. He said threatening an attorney was a bad idea, and that harassment charges could be added to the growing list of problems they were facing. Dennis muttered something about lawyers being scum, but he backed up when Michael turned his phone camera toward him. Harold tried a different approach, saying this was all a misunderstanding between family. Michael said I wasn't family with any of them, and that attempted theft wasn't a misunderstanding. He asked the movers for their paperwork, and they handed over a work order with Rebecca's signature claiming ownership. Michael took pictures of every page. 2 police cars pulled up and officers got out, and I felt my whole body relax knowing official help had arrived. The older officer asked who called, and Jake raised his hand. The officer looked at the moving truck and asked what was going on. Everyone started talking at once until the officer held up both hands and told us he'd take statements separately. He pointed at me and asked if this was my property. I said yes, and that I had the deed inside. He asked if I'd authorized anyone to move my belongings, and I said absolutely not. Michael stepped beside me and handed the officer his card, explaining he was my attorney and that the woman in question had attempted to coerce property transfer through fraud and family intimidation. The officer looked at Rebecca and asked for her identification. She handed over her license, and he asked if she owned this property. She said it was complicated. The officer said it was actually simple. Either she had legal ownership documentation, or she didn't. Rebecca said we were engaged and getting married in 2 weeks. The officer asked again if she had legal ownership documentation, and Rebecca went quiet. The other officer was talking to the movers who kept pointing at their paperwork and shaking their heads. The first officer asked me to explain what happened, and I walked him through the whole thing, from Rebecca demanding I sign over my house to her family showing up to pressure me to discovering the moving truck outside. Michael added that he'd arrived to find active theft in progress, and that the pregnancy claim appeared to be another manipulation tactic. The officer asked Rebecca if she was pregnant, and she said yes. He asked if she'd seen a doctor to confirm it, and she said not yet. Michael quietly mentioned that pregnancy tests could be faked or borrowed, which made Rebecca's face go white. The officer asked Harold for his identification and asked what his role was in this situation. Harold said he was just supporting his daughter. The officer asked if he knew the house wasn't legally hers when he helped arrange the moving truck. Harold started to answer but stopped himself. The officer wrote something in his notebook. The second officer came over and said the movers confirmed they were hired by Rebecca Walsh 3 days ago and that she'd signed documents claiming ownership of the property. The first officer asked Rebecca if she'd told the moving company she owned my house, and she said she was going to own it. The officer said that wasn't what he asked. Rebecca said she might have told them it was her house. The officer explained that hiring movers under false pretenses to take someone else's property was fraud and theft. Rebecca started crying and said I'd promised her the house. The officer looked at me and I shook my head. Michael said there was no written agreement and that verbal real estate transfers were legally void. The officer told the movers they'd been hired under fraudulent circumstances and needed to return everything to the house immediately. The head mover looked relieved and said they'd suspected something was wrong when the paperwork seemed off. They started unloading my couch, and I watched Rebecca's family stand on the sidewalk looking lost. Harold made a phone call talking fast and low. Dennis kicked at the ground. Carl stared at his phone. Rebecca sat on the curb with her head in her hands. The officers finished taking statements, and the first one told me Michael said he'd already planned to file for a temporary order within the hour. The officer approved and said it was a smart move. He told Rebecca and her family they needed to leave my property immediately and not return. Harold tried to argue, but the officer cut him off, saying they could all be arrested for trespassing if they didn't leave now. They walked to their cars slowly, Harold still on his phone, and I watched them drive away. The movers finished unloading everything and apologized for the confusion. I told them it wasn't their fault and tipped them for their trouble, which seemed to surprise them. Michael stood with me on the driveway as the truck pulled away. He said we needed to move fast on the restraining order and that he'd have emergency paperwork filed before the courthouse closed. I asked how long that would take, and he said 2 hours maximum. He asked if I had somewhere safe to stay tonight in case Rebecca or her family tried to come back. I said I'd call my sister. Michael squeezed my shoulder and said I'd done everything right by not signing those papers and by calling for help immediately. He left to file the paperwork, and Jake stayed with me while I called Hannah. She answered, and I watched her face change. She was still standing there on the driveway. The phone was pressed to her ear. Harold was pacing behind her. Dennis and Carl were leaning against their car. Jake stood beside me. Mrs. Cho had gone back to her house. The movers were finishing up. Rebecca said something into the phone and hung up. She looked at Harold. He stopped pacing. She shook her head. He kicked the ground. Dennis asked what happened. Rebecca said the bank called about the loan. They wanted to verify the collateral. They'd found out the house wasn't actually hers yet. Harold started yelling at her. She yelled back. Carl tried to calm them down. Jake touched my arm. We went back inside. The house felt different now, like it wasn't really mine anymore, even though nothing had changed legally. I walked through the rooms. Everything was back where it belonged. The couch, the chairs, the coffee table. But I kept seeing Rebecca's family planning renovations, knocking out walls, using my house as collateral. I went upstairs to the bedroom. Rebecca's clothes were still in the closet. Her makeup was in the bathroom. Her books were on on the nightstand, 3 years of her life mixed with mine. I opened the closet and started pulling her things out. Dresses, shirts, pants, shoes. I piled them on the bed. Jake came upstairs. He helped me carry armfuls of clothes downstairs. We put everything in garbage bags. Rebecca's phone charger, her laptop, her jewelry box, everything. That's when I found it. A folder in the back of her closet behind the winter coats she never wore. I opened it. The first page was a printout from a real estate website. My address, the estimated value, $800,000. The next page showed recent sales in the neighborhood, comparable houses, their prices. Someone had highlighted the highest ones. Then there were notes, handwritten, Rebecca's handwriting. I recognized it from birthday cards and grocery lists. The notes listed Harold's business loan requirements, how much he needed, what kind of collateral the bank wanted. There were dates. This went back 6 months. 6 months before she'd asked me to sign over the house, before she'd even brought it up. Jake looked over my shoulder. He swore under his breath. I kept flipping pages. There were copies of my grandmother's obituary, articles about inheritance law, information about property transfers, a timeline written in Rebecca's neat script when we'd gotten engaged, when the wedding was planned, when she'd approached me about the house, when Harold would apply for the loan. It was all planned, every single step. My hands shook. I sat down on the floor. Jake sat beside me. He didn't say anything. What was there to say? The woman I'd planned to marry had been researching how to steal my house for half a year. I thought about every conversation we'd had. Every time she'd asked about my grandmother, about the house, about my family. She'd been gathering information, building her case, planning her move. I felt sick, actually sick. My stomach turned. I ran to the bathroom. Jake followed. I threw up. Everything from the last few hours came up. When I finished, Jake handed me a towel. I washed my face, looked in the mirror. The guy looking back at me looked tired, older somehow, like he'd aged years in one afternoon. We went back downstairs. Jake called Michael, told him about the folder. Michael said he was coming back over. He arrived 20 minutes later. I showed him everything. He photographed each page. He arranged them on the coffee table. The real estate printouts, the loan requirements, the timeline, the research about inheritance law. He looked at me. This was premeditation, clear and obvious. He pulled out his phone, called someone, asked them to come over, said it was important. 30 minutes later, another man showed up. Michael introduced him as Brendan, his law partner. Brendan specialized in fraud cases. He looked at the folder, studied each page, asked me questions. When did Rebecca move in? When did she get access to the house? When did I tell her about my grandmother? When did we get engaged? I answered everything. Brendan took notes. He looked at Michael. This was good, really good. The folder showed clear planning. The moving company hired in advance. The family's coordinated pressure. The fake pregnancy test timed perfectly. This wasn't a relationship dispute. This was attempted theft, fraud, conspiracy. He thought the DA would be very interested. Cases like this didn't come along often. Everything was documented. The evidence was clear. Rebecca had made it too easy. Brendan said he'd contact the detective tomorrow. Show him everything. This changed the case significantly. Michael agreed. He told me to keep the folder safe. Don't let Rebecca know I'd found it. Don't mention it to anyone except law enforcement. This was evidence now. Important evidence. They left around 7. Jake stayed. He ordered pizza. We sat in the living room eating, not talking much. My phone kept buzzing. Text messages, phone calls. I looked at the screen. Friends asking about the wedding, asking if everything was okay, asking what happened. I didn't answer, didn't know what to say. How do you explain this? Jake's phone buzzed too. He looked at it, frowned, showed me the screen. It was a Facebook post from Rebecca. I read it. My hands started shaking again. She was claiming I was abusive, that I'd threatened her, that she'd barely escaped, that her family had to rescue her belongings while I was being violent and controlling. The post had already been shared 15 times. Comments were piling up. People saying they were sorry, saying they'd had no idea, saying they were glad she got out safely. Jake scrolled down. There were more posts. Rebecca's friends sharing her story, adding their own comments, saying they'd always thought something was off about me, that I'd isolated her, that they were worried but hadn't known how to help. I couldn't believe it. None of it was true. Not one word, but people were believing it, sharing it, adding to it. Jake called Hannah. She answered on the first ring. He told her about the posts. She was already looking at them. She'd been tagged in several. She said she'd handle it. Not to worry, she'd call me back. She hung up. 10 minutes later, she called. She'd been going through Rebecca's social media, taking screenshots of everything, the posts, the comments, the shares. She was documenting it all. This was defamation, slander. Michael needed to see it. Jake agreed. He texted Michael, sent him screenshots. Michael responded immediately. This was bad, but also helpful. It showed Rebecca's character, her willingness to lie, to manipulate, to destroy someone's reputation to cover her own crimes. He said, don't respond, don't engage, don't comment on any of it. That's what she wanted. Drama, a public fight, something she could twist and use against me. Stay silent for now. We'd address it properly later. Hannah came over. She brought her laptop. showed me everything Rebecca had posted. It was worse than I'd thought. She was claiming I'd forced her to sign a prenup that left her with nothing, that I'd threatened to kick her out if she didn't agree, that she'd been living in fear for months. None of it was real. We'd never even discussed a prenup. I'd never threatened her with anything, but the lies were spreading. People were believing them. Hannah said we needed to respond. Not emotionally, not defensively, just facts. Simple, clear facts. Jake agreed. He pulled up a notes app on his phone, started typing. We worked together, crafting a statement. Short, factual.